My name is Sam Worden and I teach photography and yearbook and English at Antioch High School. If you're watching this video, you're probably in one of those classes. If you're not in one of those classes, I guess you found it just by mistake. It's my tiny little channel. Feel free to come in and watch. I'm recording a lot of this stuff because this year we've got the whole COVID-19 coronavirus thing going on, and it's now July, and I'm assuming that I'm going to spend a lot of my teaching time this semester only seeing 1/3 of my class every week, and it's going to rotate every other week, or every third week, A, B, C weeks. So it seemed to me a good idea to have video copies of all the direct instruction that I'd be planning on doing in class. That way, if you're in class and you didn't get something, you can always go back to the video and check it out. And if you weren't in class, the video should cover all the same basic stuff that we did in class. In fact, it might be better because we're outside, and inside we'd be in a, fluorescent lit classroom. So what my intention is to go over introductions to units and the basic concepts that we're going to do. And for each assignment, I'm going to do a walkthrough of how to do the assignment. So if you're just viewing this just for fun, feel free to do the assignments. I guess you could even send them to me if you want. Since I have, at this point, 1 subscriber, I think I can handle that. But if you're in my class, then make sure you're checking Google Classroom and all that stuff to make sure you've got your right due dates and stuff. If you're in one of the other classes, other photography classes, if this is getting shared from to the other photography class at ACHS or maybe even Lakes, then the concepts will work pretty well. I think we're trying to align our assignments, so that should go pretty well as well. If you're in yearbook or TomTom and you're new and you're just figuring out the cameras, these videos should be really helpful. I'm focusing primarily on the T6 for most of the introductory stuff, since that's the camera that we give out to our beginning students. I will also do some basic overviews of the more advanced features of the EOS RP and the 7D Mark II. The 7D Mark II, that's our newer one that we just got. That's our sports camera. And the EOS RP, we've got 3 or 4 of those. Those are our mirrorless cameras. So today I want to talk about how exposure works and just the basics of how to get a picture that's not too bright and not too dark. We're going to talk a little bit about how to focus, and that's really just how to set up the focus on the camera. But beyond that, I don't want to get into any of the fancy kind of stuff. We'll get to that in the next lesson. The next video will be focusing on just how shutter speed affects the picture beyond making it bright and dark. For today, I just want to focus on, is it bright enough? Is it dark enough? So there's some stuff that you should understand about how cameras work. And the first is that a camera has a certain amount of dynamic range, okay? There's very bright stuff. If you take a look at that sun, that's probably the brightest part of the exposure in this picture. And then there's the shadows, which are kind of down here, and the camera can record a certain range between bright and dark. This camera, the video that I've got right now, is not recording everything. If it were, then you'd actually be able to see detail in the sun. You can't, right? It's just it's a washed out exposure there. So that's just one of the things that you have to think about with a camera, is that your eye has a wider dynamic range than a camera does, and your brain can switch between looking at the shadows and the brights so fast that you don't even notice it. So when you see something, you're like, oh, that's pretty, and you just take a picture, sometimes your camera captures all the range between shadows and light, and sometimes it can't capture all that, and so it'll lose the darkest parts are just pure black, and the brightest parts are just come out pure white, or one or the other. And you've probably seen that taking pictures yourself sometime. If you've taken any pictures, and I'm assuming that everybody has, because we've all got some variation on this, especially if you're taking pictures of people's faces, you see like shadows under their eyes and stuff. It's funny, we notice everything about faces. Like anything's a little bit off, we're like, oh, that looks bad, because everybody knows faces so well. So my goal is to give you a little bit of an overview of how to make the camera do the exposure that you want. And that's what you're going to practice for the next week or two. And whether or not the pictures are blurry or well composed, I don't care at this point, because I really just want you to be able to focus on making the camera get the exposure and the brightness that you want, and understanding how shutter speed, aperture, and ISO contribute this little triangle. Maybe I'll do it over here. Maybe I can put a little graphic there. I don't know. We'll see. There's a triangle of shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. Those are the 3 main controls that every camera has. And those basically control almost everything important about how your picture comes out. If you can understand how those three interact and how they balance each other out, then you're going to have a massive part of the battle already under your belt. That's a weird mixed metaphor, but you should be able to not worry about that and then worry about what makes the picture cool. But you can't make a cool picture unless you can make the picture come out as a picture, right? All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at some of the controls on this, this Rebel T6 and make sure that we understand how that stuff works. So first, if you look right here, this is your shutter release button. You press that and it takes the picture. And this is the shutter speed, which controls how fast the shutter opens. Now, when it comes to shutter speed, basically the gist is that the longer the shutter is open and letting light hit the camera, the brighter the picture is going to be. So if you've got a very small amount of light, then if you only open it for a fraction of a second, the picture is going to be black. But if you open it for like a minute, it's going to slowly trickle in and fill it up. Just like if you were to turn on a sink just a little bit and leave it for a long time, it'll fill up. Shutter speed ranges from about 30 seconds is your longest automatic speed. And when you're looking at your light meter, that'll be a 30 with a little quotation mark after it. And then it goes down to like 20 and 15, 10, and goes up to about 1/8,000th of a second. If you're not good at math, join the club. I'm not good at math either. But you've got to remember that 1/8,000th of a second is smaller, which means shorter, than 1/800th of a second, which in turn is shorter than 1/80th of a second, and which is shorter than 1/8th of a second. So the camera is not going to give you the 1 in the slash, it's just going to give you the number by itself. So if the camera is saying you're at 1/8,000th of a second, then what you'll get is just an 8,000 there. So if you get lost, just remember that. Now the other one, the control that you need to worry about is the aperture. That's this button right here. So it says AV, and you hold that down and twist the shutter dial, and that controls your aperture. Now the aperture is the size of the hole that the shutter opens up. The smaller the number, the bigger the hole, the more light gets in. So aperture, and then you refer to them in f-stops, would be f/ and then the number. So an f-stop of f1.8 is a pretty wide open aperture, and that's going to let in a lot of light. But as the number goes up, the hole gets smaller and the aperture gets lets in less light. So f1.8 is a much wider aperture than f16. That's a very small one. The last one is ISO, and that is, you have the ISO button right here, and you hold, just tap that down and it brings up a menu, and you can switch between ISO 100 up to 6400 on this camera. And 100 is the least sensitive, and the advantage of that is that it's like having a deep sink that you have to fill up with a lot of water, but you get more depth, and that's like color depth and stuff. If you get ISO 6400, it's a very shallow sink. You can still get the picture, but it's going to be grainy. It's not going to have that same color depth. So what I'd like to do now is I'm going to set up the camera right in front of this one, and we're just going to play with looking at shutter speed and stuff, and how to gauge how bright your pictures are, and how to get the proper exposure in a couple of different scenarios. And then I will ask you to play with that a lot in the future. Okay, so let's take a look at the camera. Okay, there is one thing that I want you guys to all do, okay? And it's gonna be setting up your camera to focus using this button here. So it's a little bit tricky, but I'm just going to tell you exactly what to do, and you just do it and you'll be good. So we hit the menu button, which brings up this, and you're going to go all the way to the right until you get to this wrench here. And then that brings up a bunch of things. You go to custom functions, and then you're going to go to the right again a bunch of times, I think to number 8. Yep. And then you hit set, AE lock, AF, set, menu, and then I don't know if you can hear that or not. I can hear it. That when you hold this down, it starts to focus the camera. So when you want to take a picture, focus it first. Like, well, get your exposure set the way you want it, focus, and then fire. And then you've got your picture right there. Okay, that's all the technical stuff. So let's talk about what we want to do with it. There are two different ways to look at the picture that you're taking while you take it. The way I use most of the time is to look through this viewfinder. And what that does is a little prism that goes down to a mirror and then shoots straight through the lens. And then when you want to take a picture, you hit the shutter button and the mirror flips up, you take the picture, it flips back down and you can see again. I prefer that because, one, when your eye is right up to it, you're seeing the whole picture that you're taking, so you see it in large scope. And also the focus and shutter speed is much more responsive than in live view. Live view is sluggish. Live view, though, when you hit this button, the advantage of that is you can see exactly what your exposure is as you're doing it. So if you make the picture darker, it's going to get darker before you even take it. You'll just see it on the screen. So if I move the shutter speed, if I increase my shutter speed here, it's getting darker, getting lighter. I can increase my aperture as well, and then, oh, look at that. Suddenly it's nice and dark. So you can see what you're doing to the picture as you're doing it, which is really nice. And that's what we're going to play with right now. If you look at the bottom of the screen, there's a little light meter right there. And when it thinks you've got a good exposure, this line will be in with there. So let's speed up that shutter a little bit. So now at 1/3200th of a second, which is the shutter speed right here, at f5.6 and ISO 400, that says that's a pretty good exposure. When you're looking through the viewfinder, you'll still have a light meter like that. And that's what people have been using for decades to take pictures, is a light meter that sort of tells them what their exposure is going to look like. So while we're doing this live view, even though you can see it getting brighter and darker, I want you to think about the light meter so that you don't get locked to shooting in live view, right? You can still shoot through the viewfinder, because a lot of things, just about anything but landscape, I think is hard to shoot live view on a camera like this, because it's going to move a little bit and you're just not going to keep up with it. So let's take a look at how your shutter speed works. First thing I'm going to do is turn live view off, and I'm going to set your ISO down to 100. This is your menu for your ISO settings. Auto is just going to change it automatically for you. Please don't do that. Anytime the camera is doing anything automatic, I don't think it's doing a pretty good job. It's just looking for the average, and I'd rather you know exactly what's going on and just do it yourself. So let's just start off with 100. 100 is going to give you the best, the least sensitive, which means that it's going to get the best colors and it's not going to get grain and noise and that kind of stuff. 200 is still pretty good. 400 is still pretty solid. 800 you're going to start noticing noise. 1600 you're definitely going to notice some noise. 3200 and 6400, do them if you've got to. Like if you're shooting in a gym and the light is bad and you need to freeze fast action, fine, go up to 32 or 6400. But in general, start off with your lowest ISO and see what you can get. And then we're going to go back to live view. So then things look pretty dark at 100. So I'm just twisting this dial to the left, and you can see the shutter speed is going down. We're at 500th of a second, 400th of a second, 320, and 160. And if you notice over here, this is called a histogram. What that does is it tells you where all your tones are. So there's a spike in the darks here, and then there's a spike in the brights, and then there's not a whole lot of like this mid-tone stuff. So it's like black, shadow, mid-tone, highlights, whites. Anything that, when the information starts to go off the right, that's called blowing your highlights, which means that the brightest parts of the picture are now just pure white, and you probably can't recover those. If they are going all the way off to the left, that means your darkest parts are now pure black, and you can recover pure blacks that are lost, but they're going to be grainy. So ideally, you're going to find something where all the information is neither spiking to the left or the right. Because we're shooting right into the sun, that's just not going to happen. So we've got to find an exposure that works for us okay. The reason why I like the histogram, and I like to leave that on the display, if you're not seeing your histogram, by the way, what you want to do is hit this display button, and that changes the stuff that you can see on the screen. So just keep hitting it, and then eventually the histogram will pop up. So the nice thing about the histogram is when you're shooting outside, if you're shooting in direct sunlight, a lot of times it's hard to see what's going on the screen. Like I can kind of see it right now with my eyes, but there's a lot of glare on it, and it's hard to get an actual accurate idea of what the picture looks like. But the histogram doesn't lie. So this tells me this stuff down here, that's way too dark. So what I need to do is maybe I'm going to hold my AV down and I'm going to drag my aperture as far open as that goes, f3.5. And then I can see that my shadows are going right down to the edge, but they're not quite clipping. And then I can get it even brighter if I want by reducing the shutter speed. Now, let's say I want this to be kind of bright because I want all this shadow stuff to come out. So I'm going to get to the point where the shadows are almost off almost off, but they're still peaking in the shadow area. So let's say that's my exposure that I like. ISO 100, shutter speed 500, aperture f3.5. Looking at the light meter, it says that I'm 2 stops overexposed. So that means it's 4 times as bright as it thinks it should be. But it's a computer and I'm a human being and I say I like it, so I'm going to do that. So the key thing that I think is really important to understand here is that I don't like to think in terms of math, I like to think in terms of number of clicks. So each click of shutter speed is the exact same amount of light change as each click of your aperture. So watch this. So I'm going to decrease, I'm going to brighten it up. So from 1/500th of a second down to 1/400th of a second. It is now brighter. It's too bright for me, I don't like it. So I'm going to get the same exposure by holding down AV and reducing my aperture. I'm going up a number, but remember, the bigger the number, the smaller the aperture, the smaller the hole letting light in. So now I have the same exposure as I had before, just with different stuff, because I brightened it by 1 click with the shutter speed and I darkened it by 1 click with the aperture, which evens it back out again. So if I go to 2 clicks brighter with the shutter speed, boom, boom, to 250, I take the aperture, I go 2 clicks down, boom. And that's the same exposure there. And it just goes that way all over. Let's say 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. So that suddenly just evens it back out. Now I'm at 1/100th of a second, f8. So all of those things you can kind of play with. Let's say that I want a really wide, like a depth of field, so I'm going to increase my aperture all the way up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 9 clicks. So now to get the same shutter speed, same exposure, I now have to go 9 clicks down with a shutter speed. So 1, 2, 3, 4. That was 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Now I'm at 1/15th of a second. And I've got the same exposure. Maybe I want to keep it a faster shutter speed. So let's look at the last thing that you can do. Let's say I go 1, 2, 3. That's a full stop. Now I need to increase my ISO a full stop as well. So now I've just doubled it there, 200. Every 3 clicks right now, because this is measuring in thirds of a stop, every 3 clicks is the same as another step up in your ISO. So if I go back here, should have the exposure that I had. So I'm at ISO 200 now, and that lets me go up from 1/10th of a second to 1/30th of a second. They all kind of go that way. So let's say, let's crank up my ISO. I turn this off, ISO 1600. Now, picture's very bright, even though I've got a very tiny aperture of f22. So I just need to bring my shutter speed back up in line to get it in that basic area that I want. Most of the time, as you saw me doing earlier, I'll just count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 one way, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 the other way with the shutter speed of the aperture, whatever it is that you're trying to match. But sometimes, like I just did there, the math gets a little bit too much for me, and I just remember kind of where my histogram was. So I increase the ISO and I say, okay, well then I'll just crank up my shutter speed till I get something that looks okay to me. And that still looks okay. The key to all of this is that you are the human being and you know what you want your picture to look like. You know what looks good to you. As you're messing with it, if it looks good, that's it. So don't get all freaked out about the histogram and stuff like that. You just want to use the histogram to help you say, okay, I've got as much information on my sensor as I possibly can get. If you start clipping the blacks, then it's just not happening, and it's clipping the whites, that's just not happening. That's how exposure works. Okay, so that is a lot of technical stuff to remember, right? Shutter speed, aperture, ISO. What I want you to do, before we even get to your first assignment, and we'll go through the assignment in a second video, is just walk around and take pictures, okay? So if I start pointing out here, that's pretty bright. I'm gonna say, let's see, my ISO, let's drop that back down to 100, and I put my aperture at maybe f8 or so. And then looking through here at the shutter, at the light meter says that a perfect exposure is 200th of a second. Focus. And my picture came out actually great, because there's not looking to the side, that's all lit by the sun. Then if I go right back into these shadows over here, that's much darker. Now I gotta reduce my shutter speed and my aperture to brighten it back up. And I've got a combination of that bright stuff there and then the dark shadows, and that didn't really come out. It was too much. Let's see. Well, let's try and meet the middle. We'll get some shadows and some highlights. And there we go. That kind of works. So you're walking around just trying different exposures. Look for the dark, look for the bright. Try shooting the same exposure with a bunch of different settings. Try shoot it with a fast shutter speed and figure out what you need to do for your ISO and your aperture. Try shooting it with a slow shutter speed and figure out what you need to do for your ISO and your aperture. Try saying like, okay, I'm gonna do a really tight aperture. I'm gonna go up to f16 and then figure out what you need to do for your shutter speed to get those going on. The camera's pretty small, so carry it around. Just be like, oh, let's shoot this. Be that annoying person with the camera. You're gonna get, if you enjoy photography, you're gonna become that person anyways. So you might as well rip that Band-Aid off and just be like, I'm the camera nerd and I'm gonna carry it around. So that is what you should do. Don't worry about getting great pictures at this point. Get comfortable with just the basic controls of exposure and find as many different circumstances as you can to just get the picture lit the way that you want it. And just by controlling the three things that we talked about, your shutter speed, your aperture, and your ISO. All right, until next time, good luck and have fun noodling with your cameras.